Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114 Global Moral Issues, where today we're going to start looking at one of our two main problems and topics in our discussion of corruption, money, and politics. In particular, we're going to be diving into a concept called the Doctrine of Double Effect. We'll take a look at some of its applications, how it gets used, and how it might apply to the problem at hand. So, just to give us a sense of what it is we're going to be doing, we're going to start off with our usual sort of recap, bringing to mind some of the terminology that's useful to have for this sort of discussion. We're then going to take a very brief, and I mean brief, look at a couple of consequentialist arguments surrounding our topic. But then we get into our main focus, the doctrine of double effect, the four conditions that it states have to be satisfied for an act to be morally permissible under the right circumstances. And then we'll also take a look at how this applies to Citizens United and issues of corruption, and then some of the difficulties with the doctrine of double effect and some of the challenges that can be raised against it and things that we have to keep in mind when we think through this sort of principle and this sort of problem, which is honestly the main goal of this entire class. It's less to tell you how to think than here's some things that you need to be aware of to become a better moral thinker about these topics. But all that said, let's bring up some very old and very straightforward vocab just so that we make sure we've got it clear. This unit's not heavy on new vocab. There's only a couple of terms that I really need you to know. So I think it's a good place for us to pause a little bit and bring back some of the terminology that we've been using over and over, but I think particularly comes up again in these discussions. So remember that for this unit, we're focusing on money, corruption, and politics. In particular, the couple of questions: can corruption, that is, can benefiting from one's position or status as a leader or a ruler in government or in business or whatever else, can it ever be morally acceptable? And is it ever morally necessary or obligatory? Is it ever required of us if we're in certain situations? Now, as far as terminology goes, we're going to be talking a fair bit about moral theories as we emphasize what the doctrine of double effect actually is. Remember that when we talk about moral theories, we're talking about explanations about what's right and wrong and why. And it's the explaining part that's the important thing to keep in mind with these. Similarly, the slightly more complicated bits of vocab, it's worth reminding ourselves what consequentialism and deontology actually are. Remember that both of these are not individual theories on their own. Instead, consequentialism and deontology are both families of theories. These are both umbrella terms that have a lot of different views and viewpoints underneath them. And each of those different views is united by some common feature that brings that family of views together. In the case of consequentialism, it's the family of theories that explain right and wrong in terms of the consequences of an action. That is, they look to the consequences of what we do to determine and explain why an act is right or wrong in a given circumstance. Similarly, deontology is sometimes known as non-consequentialism because it's a family of theories that look at things besides just the consequences to determine right and wrong and to explain right and wrong. Deontological theories look at intentions, or perhaps whether or not an action adheres to certain moral rules and principles. It might look at how well it fits in with reason or the commands of God or some other feature besides just the consequences of an action. Consequences might still matter depending on the theory, but they're not the defining or all-important detail that determines whether an act is right or wrong. That role gets given to something else. Now, another thing from the past I want to bring up again, sort of a flashback, if you will, are trolley problems. All that perennial all-time favorite. Remember that way back in like the first or second unit, I believe second unit in this class, we talked briefly about this thought experiment involving a runaway trolley car that is hurtling down the track towards 5 people that are trapped on it. And you, being a helpless bystander, realize that you're not quite so helpless. You have a choice, a switch that you can throw and divert the trolley car onto a side track, onto a spur, if you will, that only has one person trapped on it. And in that case, you have the option then of killing that one to save the lives of the 5 people stuck on the original track. And recall, too, that in the original trolley problem, the majority opinion, the generally believed to be the right answer is to throw the switch, killing one to save 5. This isn't universally agreed on. It's not necessarily the right answer, but it's widely believed to be the right answer. And at the very least, it's the intuitive answer for most people. We also have the so-called fat man scenario, another version of the trolley problem in which instead of a switch being thrown to kill one to save 5, instead you have the option of pushing a very, very large man off of a footbridge and placing him in front of the trolley so that by killing him, the trolley will stop, saving the 5 lives still stuck on the track. Now here, the intuitive answer seems to be that it's wrong to push the fat man, that there's some kind of a difference between this situation and the previous one, despite the fact that it's still an example of killing one to save 5. Now, the reason why I bring these up is because, in a way, trolley problems are actually good parallels for our topic for this unit. And we can use them as test cases to try out some of the different theories and perspectives that we're going to look at. In particular, each of the trolley problems involves an action. And if we want to go with the intuitive answers, they involve an action taken with 2 kinds of results, one good and one bad. Namely, killing someone, a small set of someones, depending on the version of the problem, in order to still save many, either throwing the switch to kill one to save 5, or pushing the fat man to kill one and save 5. And if we look at things like Citizens United, the issue of money in politics is largely similar to this same sort of situation, both in the US and around the world. The more money that we allow to be involved in politics, at least as citizens, the more permissible, or the more that we allow money to play a large role in the democratic process, then we open up more and more avenues for corruption, for corporate influence, for special interests, and other things to dominate the political landscape and to make it much easier to be corrupt. And we usually have this sort of case, at least in the United States, as just a clear example of this sort of thing, in the name of protecting free speech, or in the name of allowing democracy to function unhindered in a certain way. There's some sort of good result that's aimed at with allowing these sorts of things, but they usually have, at least partially, the negative result of allowing for more money to play a role in politics and lead to some very negative outcomes, in both morally speaking and just in general effect. So it's not like the trolley problem and the question of money in politics are really 2 separate sorts of topics. They're different, and they're used in very different contexts, trolley problems. So we shouldn't say that they're exactly the same, but they are good parallels that can help us test out a few different perspectives. Because if we come up with some sort of an answer or some sort of a view about money in politics, we can then apply it to the trolley problems to see how well this theory, this explanation, does at explaining the difference between these 2 cases, or explaining why it is or isn't permissible to do this sort of action, this action with 2 different effects to it. And it's this sort of thing that I want us to get practice at. Because again, this class really isn't about, here's every aspect of this moral issue that you should know about. Instead, this class is about becoming a better moral thinker, getting more practice and developing the skill of thinking carefully about moral problems and issues, And I think here there's a couple of different lessons that we can pull from this. For one, we can get more and more practice at comparing analogies and, not comparing analogies, but comparing analogous cases. That is, drawing analogies and drawing connections between similar sorts of cases that don't always appear similar on the surface, and also using those to test out our theories and to try the limits of our different philosophical opinions, of our different ethical opinions. And the better we get at this, the better we can apply the skill and the more confidently we can apply this skill to other problems. So doing this kind of thinking, I think, is a very beneficial thing for us. And that's in addition to getting more acquainted with the various concepts and perspectives that we actually look at each problem with. So there is some method to the madness here. It's not just because I love trolley problems or I love the topic of money and politics and that sort of thing, though both of those are at least a little bit true. I do very much find this interesting. But, it's a side effect of working on 2.5 degrees in this stuff. Now, when it comes to money and politics, when it comes to moral arguments having to do with this question, mainly the question of, is it permissible for corruption to occur in society? Is this something that we should be morally okay with? It's worth at least taking a brief look at the consequentialist side of this discussion, or look at how consequentialist theories might take a stand one way or another on this. And in general, consequentialist theories, they look at consequences. They use the same kind of reasoning that the majority opinion in Citizens United used. So here, rather than looking at moral principles or saying that, we should be more honest or whatever else, consequentialist theories are going to look at the results of whatever action it is that we as citizens are trying to evaluate. So if we're trying to judge the moral status of the court decision Citizens United, then consequentialist theories would have us weigh the results of that sort of decision. Did it produce more good than bad? If so, if this was the best possible outcome, or if it was a good enough outcome, depending on the theory, then yes, it's morally permissible. It's perfectly fine for this decision to have been made. They didn't do anything wrong. We simply weigh the good results against the bad results. But rather than dive into a set of particular consequentialist theories that are going to end up looking somewhat the same, because again, as I mentioned in the intro, we've done this kind of reasoning before. I want to look at just a couple of things that sort of plague consequentialist theories in general when they look at these topics. Because like I said, we've used these sorts of theories in the past. When we look at Singer's arguments about, say, alleviating suffering in the world, we're using consequentialist reasoning in this sort of case. When we look at the idea that animals should be given equal consideration to equal moral consideration as human beings, as we looked at in the environmental ethics unit, we're again using consequentialist reasoning. We're looking at the results of an action, of how we treat animals or how we spend our money in each of those two examples, and we say, well, what is the best result? What action produces the best possible consequences? And we may define those differently. In the case of animal ethics, we looked at suffering. And in the case, we looked at suffering in both cases. We looked at how much suffering can I alleviate with spending my money by giving it to charity versus buying a TV or whatever else. We're looking at the consequences of that action and judging it accordingly. Different theories simply define the good differently. But so the trick and the challenge to these sorts of theories, and the thing we've not dug into yet with any of them, is that there is some difficulty in defining precisely what the good is. What sort of things should we look for when we evaluate good and bad consequences? Because it's one thing to say we're going to weigh the good results against the bad ones, but the good results on its own is incredibly vague. This is something that very much has to be pinned down in order to have a complete philosophical theory. And different theories have different conceptions of the good. For example, classical utilitarianism defines the good in terms of happiness, or more modern versions of utilitarianism define it in terms of well being. But classical utilitarianism, just giving the most straightforward sort of theory, defines the good in terms of human psychology. We naturally pursue things that make us happy, things that are pleasurable and enjoyable, and so on, and we naturally avoid pain and suffering. So it seems rather straightforward to define goodness and badness in terms of these things that we naturally pursue or naturally avoid. And so this sort of theory says you should perform the action that produces the greatest amount of happiness in when it says that you should perform the action with the best consequences. Producing the most happiness is the best sort of consequence. But this is not a widely accepted theory of the good. It's not universally acknowledged. We might instead say that the good involves maximizing respect of persons, or it maximizes the number of living things, or perhaps we value knowledge above all things. Then we should perform the actions that maximize knowledge and learning above anything else. There's actually an interesting paper called Consequentialize This that was written by a contemporary philosopher just a couple of years ago. I think it's 2013 is the publication date for it. But he essentially argues that there's a number of theorists who say for any value whatsoever, you can build a consequentialist theory around it. It may not be plausible, it may not be acceptable, but you can build a consequentialist theory around it. And it's the plausibility of these that ends up being one of the theoretical issues. Depending on what it is we determine to be good and valuable, this has a large effect on how plausible the theory as a whole is. Classical utilitarianism is largely rejected precisely because it has an inadequate notion of what goodness is. It doesn't have a good definition or theory of the good. It doesn't clearly explain, or it doesn't adequately explain, what it means for something to be good. Because there's a lot of things besides just pleasure and happiness that we human beings value, or that we think that we ought to value. And it may just be the wrong kind of explanation. A lot of people say that we shouldn't look at things like human psychology for things like value. Instead, we should be looking at principles. We should look at what we ought to treat in certain ways. So there's a number of different issues that surround this kind of topic. There's also the general problem, and I think we've mentioned very briefly before, of whether or not we should look at actual or expected outcomes if we're going to do a consequentialist analysis of court decisions like Citizens United or various policies that allow more money in politics. And again, there are a number of controversial debates surrounding this sort of topic. But this is not really where I want to spend most of our focus. Because, as I said, we've looked at this kind of reasoning a couple of different times on a couple of different topics. Instead, I would rather focus on a sort of non-consequentialist concept. In particular, I want to focus on a principle that's included in many deontological theories, not all of them by far. In fact, this is one of the more controversial ideas that comes up in deontological ethics. But it is also one of the most common ones to crop up in multiple theories. And it's a concept called the Doctrine of Double Effect. Now, the Doctrine of Double Effect is not a complete theory on its own. It's rather a piece of a theory. It's a principle. It's a concept or an idea that we can use as a foundation or as part of an explanation along with the rest of a complete moral theory. In particular, the Doctrine of Double Effect is a principle that attempts to explain how an action with two different effects, one good, one bad, or if we go back to some of the original versions of this, one good, one evil, can be morally permissible in some cases and impermissible in others. So like there's a lot of actions out there that have two different sorts of effects, one good, one bad. For example, shooting Hitler in the face is an action that has two different sorts of results. On the one hand, You shot Hitler in the face and, presumably ended some massive tragedy if you actually had a time machine and could go back and do it and all that sort of thing. On the other hand, you shot a human being in the face, which is a pretty negative sort of outcome. Now, depending on who you're talking to, especially if you just yank somebody off the street, they might say that the good outweighs the bad, but they're already starting to say why this action with two different results might be permissible in this case. Whereas if we were to go back to the Fat Man scenario, and rather than pushing him off the bridge, you simply decided to shoot him in the head, and by chance, he turned out to be the next version of Hitler in 2019 or something like that. Well, there again, we have an action perhaps with two different results, one good and one bad, but it seems quite different than doing it against the historical Hitler. Or we might look at all sorts of other types of actions. We might look at everyday, very minor sorts of things that we do. Things that cause us suffering while helping someone else, or vice versa. We might look at just countless sorts of different activities that have multiple sorts of results. Very rarely in life do actions have only one sort of consequence to them. So we can use concepts like the doctrine of double effect to help explain why these similar sorts of actions, ones with multiple different moral results, are permissible in some instances and impermissible in others. And when we talk about something being morally permissible, I think it's worth stressing that we're talking about things not just that we're kind of okay with, but rather we mean something rather technical and specific. We mean that it is something that is not forbidden, that it's something that, morally speaking, is acceptable to do, but is not necessarily required of us. So if we want to break down the different sorts of terms that we use to discuss ethics, we have some terms like obligatory, which means that we ought to do them. We have a duty or an obligation to do them. We might also talk about things that are forbidden, things that we ought not to do, that it's wrong to do in some sense. And in the middle, and depending on how you split up your deontic categories, overlapping with a couple of these, we have things that are morally permissible. Something that's permissible is something that it's acceptable to do. It's not wrong, it's not forbidden, but it's not necessarily required of us. For examples of morally permissible things, we might say that, there's countless examples of things. We might say something like, in general, we say that lying is not permissible because lying is something that you shouldn't do. You ought not do it. You have at least some kind of an obligation to not lie. But say if you're lying to a friend about a surprise birthday party, this seems to be okay. It doesn't seem like you're doing something wrong in this kind of instance. At least most of us would say. Some people have very strong opinions about lying. They would hold as something more like an absolute prohibition against lying. But most of us would say that lying about a surprise party is something that's acceptable. It's not just something that people are okay with in like an emotional sense, but rather we mean you're not performing some kind of a moral wrong when you do it. And it's in this sense that we talk about things being permissible or not with the doctrine of double effect. This is a concept that helps explain when certain things are permissible and when they're not. And in particular, it focuses on actions with two kinds of moral results. Now, the doctrine of double effect itself states that an act with two different kinds of effects is morally permissible so long as a set of conditions are met. There are a number of different ways of formulating this sort of thing, some of which go all the way back to medieval philosophy and the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, as in Saint Thomas Aquinas, the guy who the Aquinas Center, the Catholic campus church at West Lafayette, is named after. Thomas Aquinas was one of the first people to formulate some version of the doctrine of double effect, and it's been widely endorsed and held by the Catholic Church ever since. But it's been formulated a number of different ways in the centuries since then. One of the most common ways of doing it, and one of the more modern phrasings of it, for our sake, lists the four conditions as these four. First, the action in itself, from its very object, must be good or at least indifferent. The good effect and not the evil effect be intended. The good effect is not produced by means of the evil effect. And the good effect must be proportional to the evil effect. What these four mean is that, we can go through these one by one, but each of these provides some element of an explanation. They help give part of an explanation why an act that produces bad or evil results can still be morally acceptable. Because each of these are features or properties that action have that sort of excuse it in certain ways from being morally impermissible, from being wrong for us to do. And so the doctrine of double effect says that so long as all four of these are met, an action can still be permissible. If the act has two effects, one good and one bad, and fails even a single one of these four, the doctrine of double effect says that it's no longer permissible because it has this feature that automatically makes it morally wrong in some sense. So let's run through these four in a little bit more detail, sort of rephrase them in perhaps a more ordinary sort of English. So, first off, the action in itself, in its very object, be good or at least indifferent. So here we're looking at the nature of the action in question. If we're looking at an explanation for why an act with two different effects can still be permissible in some cases and not permissible in others, it matters very much what kind of action we're talking about. If we're looking at reasons why, or say to a certain degree, excuses why an act with a bad result can still be morally permissible, the action needs to be something that's not evil or wrong in and of itself. That is, it doesn't need to be something that by its very nature is morally wrong. So when we say that it needs to be good or at least indifferent, the act in question basically needs to just not be evil on its own. So in this case, like if we look at the trolley problem to help illustrate and demonstrate some of these different ideas, the trolley problem is one of the classic applications of this sort of idea. The action in question, say when you throw the switch, is throwing a switch to divert a trolley car. But let's say that instead of a switch, you had a baby wired up to a brain scanner or something like that. And if you torture the baby enough and you make it feel enough pain, an electrical switch will be triggered and divert the trolley car onto the side track. This is obviously morally horrible. Like, it doesn't take much argument to say that on its own, torturing babies is morally wrong. I think we can pretty much agree on this one. So long as there's such a thing as morality at all, we can agree on this. That sort of action would fail the first condition because in and of itself, the action itself is morally wrong. It's not either morally neutral or good. It's on the wrong end of the spectrum there. So the first condition is simply ruling out those actions that are in their very nature bad or wicked or morally wrong in some sense. Now, the second condition says that the good effect and not the evil effect be intended. Other ways of phrasing this might say that the good effect is intended and the bad effect be merely foreseen in a certain way. So this condition is talking about the intentions of the person doing the action. If we go back to the trolley example, let's assume that the right answer, that the action that we're going to talk about is throwing the switch and sending the trolley car onto the sidetrack to kill one and save five. Now, when you throw the switch, you're not trying to kill the person on the other side. This is something that happens, but if you could avoid it, you probably would. Instead, you're throwing the switch for a good reason. You're trying to save the lives of the people on the other track. So the good result out of the two that come from this action, the good result is the one that you actually have intentions for. This is the one you actually want to happen. Whereas the bad effect is something that's expected. You know it's going to happen. It's not a surprise. But if you could do this without killing them, you totally would. It's foreseen, but not intended. You know it's going to happen, but you're not trying to do it. And in fact, if you could skip it, you probably would. So that's what this condition is all about. The third condition is related, but rather than dealing with the intentions of the person, it has to do with the structure of the situation. So when we talk about the good effect is not produced by means of the evil effect, this means that we can't use the evil effect to produce the good one. That is, we can't use evil as a tool to bring about good things, because that's going to start running afoul of this other condition. If we're using the evil effect to produce good things, then what we're really doing is trying to produce a certain kind of evil because it's useful for us. We're trying to produce something bad so that we can get good results from it. So the situation has to be set up in such a way that the evil effect or the bad effect is a side effect. And that's not the main thing that's trying to be produced. And we can't use it as a method to produce our good result. Instead, the good result has to be produced just on its own as a direct consequence of the action. It can't be produced by the bad effect in a longer chain. This becomes, we'll get to that in a moment. We can demonstrate how this sort of thing shuts down in a moment and how it illustrates the difference between this case and the fat man. But bear with me for a second. Now, lastly, the fourth condition says that the good effect must be proportional to the evil effect. That is, the good effect has to be worth producing something bad to get it. So, say we take another example, something different than the trolley problem. Say we have a doctor providing euthanasia, that is, medically induced, basically mercy killing, to somebody who is already dying painfully of some terminal illness. Now, one thing that the doctrine of double effect would say is that relieving a great amount of pain by administering euthanasia would be justified because the good of relieving that pain is worth ending somebody's life over. If it's massive enough, if it's debilitating enough, if there's no hope of a cure, relieving that kind of suffering might actually be worth it. But if you have a doctor who says, oh, well, you're obviously suffering from a cold. Here, let me get you something that will kill you so that you don't suffer from that cold anymore. This is not proportional. Relieving the suffering of a head cold is not worth the ending of a life. Similarly, here, we might say that killing one to save 5 is a proportional exchange. Saving 5 lives is worth losing 1. But if we were killing 5 to save 1 person, this no longer is the right way around. It's weighed too heavily in favor of the bad result. We're not getting enough good to make it worth allowing the bad to happen. So the fourth condition says that things have to be proportional. It has to be worth it at the end of the day. There has to be enough good produced that it be worth allowing the bad result to be produced. And again, if an action fails any of these 4, the doctrine says that it's not permissible. It is a morally wrong thing for us to do. So we've seen kind of how this plays out with the spur case, but what about the fat man? Because in the spur case, it seems pretty clear from the illustrations I've given that it does pass all 4. The action itself is indifferent, I would say, throwing a switch. The good effect is intended, not the evil one. We're trying to save 5 lives. We're not trying to kill somebody on the sidetrack. The good effect's not produced by means of the evil effect. We're not using the death of this guy to save these 5. In fact, the 5 are saved because of the switch in the track, not because of the death of the person. If he wasn't there at all, I'd still make the same choice. And lastly, the good effect must be proportional to the bad effect. We're saving 5 lives, which is worth the loss of one, or at least most of us would say. But in the Fat Man scenario, things play out a little bit differently. For one, the Fat Man scenario fails a number of different conditions. For one, in the Fat Man scenario, the death of the Fat Man is actually intended. It's not just foreseen. In order to stop the train, we must kill the Fat Man. We must try to kill the Fat Man. So here, the bad effect, killing someone, is intended rather than just expected or foreseen. So we're trying to produce that bad effect. So on its own, that's enough to make the Fat Man scenario fail the doctrine of double effects conditions, and it explains why there's a difference between these two. But there's a couple of other issues going on. The death of the Fat Man is also used as a means to produce the good effect. We're using the Fat Man, we're turning him into a tool to save 5 people's lives. And this seems to be wrong. We're doing something evil and then using that evil in ways that we really probably shouldn't. And then we might also look at the action itself, pushing someone off of the bridge. This is something that's no longer obvious as being morally indifferent. It's certainly not good to push people off bridges, but it's probably not morally neutral either, because pushing people off bridges just seems like a morally bad thing to do. So the doctrine of double effect says that the Fat Man scenario and the spur scenario, the one with the sidetrack, even though these two situations are similar, they're quite different morally speaking. And it helps explain why. It says that in the Fat Man scenario, we're trying to do something wrong. That is, we're not wrong. We're trying to do something bad. We're using that bad action to try and produce our good result. And the action itself is just kind of morally screwed up. We shouldn't shove people off bridges. These 3 points might help explain why killing one to save 5, why that principle, that idea, isn't consistent in both cases. The Fat Man scenario is different. It has different sorts of moral features. And as far as theoretical benefits go, if we're looking at some of the theoretical virtues of this theory, of this explanation of why the two are different, for one, it's a clear explanation. We can point to which conditions this idea failed. And interestingly enough, these are probably some of the same conditions that you guys would have cited as being reasons why you didn't think that pushing the Fat Man was the right thing to do. These are the same sorts of things that most people come up with when they cite pushing the Fat Man as being something morally wrong. So it's intuitive. It's got a lot of appeal to it. And so it's got a lot of positives to it as far as moral theories and explanations go. But we can now take this and apply it to, say, Citizens United as being an example of an action or a situation that allows for greater corruption and more money in politics with the intent of trying to save free speech or trying to preserve free speech. So the decision of Citizens United, allowing more money to influence politics in general, seems like the sort of thing that can at least have this idea apply to it, because it's a single action, removing the restrictions on corporate financial donations to election, which is not the exact terminology. It's removing limitations on electioneering communications and donations by corporations. But this action on its own has 2 different results. It is at least an attempt to preserve free speech, and it allows for more money in politics, which allows for more corruption. So it's something that has 2 different sorts of results, and it seems like a good candidate for us to apply this concept and see how well it might work. It works in explaining the 2 trolley car scenarios. It helps apply to these, and it shows the difference between these. But how well does it apply to the Citizens United type case or these corruption type cases? We can ask, does the Citizens United decision actually pass? So if we have the conditions over here, let's just run through these and see what we can do. First off, let's assume that the 9 Supreme Court justices who ruled one way or the other on this decision, if I remember, it was a 5-4 split. Let's assume that the 5 justices who made up the majority opinion were not trying to increase corruption, that they intended the good effect rather than the bad effect. But it may actually be the case that this isn't so. And if there was some evidence to come out about it, this might be enough to disqualify this as a morally acceptable court decision or as a morally acceptable policy for our country to run on or for any country to run on. But for now, let's assume that 2 is satisfied because, for one, that just seems like a reasonable thing to do. And 2, we don't really have a whole lot of evidence as to what the intentions, what the actual brain states and moods of the 9 Supreme Court justices are. So let's assume that 2 is passed or satisfied for now. Now, if we look at the other conditions and we just go down the list, first off, the action is in itself, from its very object, good or at the very least indifferent, morally speaking. It's either morally good or morally neutral. It's not something that's morally heinous in some way. It's not morally wrong in some way because of the kind of action that it is. Here, the action we're looking at is passing a bit of case law that is making a court decision that alters the law of the United States of America. So the act itself is passing a law or making a legal decision to try and protect speech. Even if we remove that last bit, that seems to imply an intention that it's a court decision, on its own, this seems like a good candidate for something that's morally indifferent. It doesn't seem to be on its own good or bad to make court decisions. In some instances, they may be morally right, in others, they may be morally wrong. But the action itself doesn't assume or doesn't have a moral judgment sort of built into it, the way that, say, murder or torturing babies or giving money to the poor does. So it seems like 1 is satisfied insofar as the action itself might be morally indifferent. Third, the good effect is not produced by means of the evil effect. This one seems to also be satisfied. If we look at the way that, say, Citizens United is argued, it says that speech would be protected in the sense that the law shouldn't restrict where speech comes from. And so speech is protected by removing regulations or limitations on how money is spent during elections by corporations. And so it's not using corruption, it's not using the influence of money in politics to protect free speech. Instead, the thing that's trying to produce that would be removing the actual legal restrictions that were preventing some speakers from speaking. But unlike the other sorts of passing conditions, well, it seems to be satisfied. It's worth noting that this is not as safely satisfied. This is perhaps a bit more controversial. Corruption isn't the means by which speech is being protected. But removing limitations on speech and allowing more money in politics is being used in order to protect speech. This is the method by which speech is being protected. So it may be the case that if allowing money in politics or allowing more money in politics is something that's morally bad, then perhaps this condition isn't passed. But that seems like it's a difficult case to judge. Perhaps at first glance, it looks like this condition is satisfied, so we might say that it is for now. But this one's definitely the weaker of the 3 that we're saying have been passed so far. So this might be a good place for opponents of this idea, or those who disagree with the overall judgment of this, to push back and deny that Citizens United actually passes this, if it does. Now, the last condition, The good effect must be proportional to the evil effect. Here we get something like the consequentialist analysis of values. Here we have to say that enough good is produced to make it proportional or worthwhile to allow the bad effect. So, oddly enough, the non consequentialist analysis of this situation comes back to the same kind of consequentialist reasoning that other sorts of theories might use, where we look and see, is this actually worth the bad effects being produced? Which is something that is not obvious either way. Protecting free speech certainly seems to be good and valuable. It would seem somewhat odd to say that it's not valuable or good in some way. And in fact, in treating it with this whole process, we're kind of assuming that that's the good result. Similarly, corruption on its own seems to be something that ought to be avoided, but it seems worth discussion whether or not the degree of corruption or the amount of undue influence that money and politics might have, it's kind of up in the air whether or not that's greater than the amount of speech actually being protected. Similarly, we might ask whether or not speech actually is being protected, whether the good's being produced very much at all. If corporations have far, far larger budgets than ordinary citizens do, then it may be the case that the good effect, protecting speech, is on average not happening very much. If, say, take Apple or Facebook or something like that, some large tech company with very, very deep pockets, if speech is dependent, at least in part, on how much money can be given to influence political candidates or to support the candidates that one believes in or that'll be beneficial to someone, then in a very real way, if most of the money being thrown around in elections comes from a small number of corporations, then the average person does not have their voice or will represented very well. And so it may be that the good effect's not being produced very much at all in this type of situation. So it looks as though Citizens United might fail the fourth condition here, but it is controversial and up in the air. It's not something that I think we can definitively say one way or the other without much more discussion than we really have time for. It's the sort of thing that we each have to go off and look at on our own and draw up our own conclusions about, especially since things like the value of protecting speech isn't exactly well measured or quantifiable in a lot of different ways. Now, all of this still allows for, and we ought to discuss, criticisms of the doctrine of double effect. Because remember, just like any other viewpoint and any other perspective we talk about in here, this is part of a moral theory. It's not a theory on its own, but it's part of moral theories that we can reject. We may not think that this is a very good or useful explanation for right and wrong. In particular, some of the criticisms that we might raise against this would be things like the doctrine of double effect assumes that the agent in question, the person doing the action, is well-intentioned to a certain degree. That is, they're not trying to produce the bad effect in the first place. Because if we didn't allow for this sort of thing, if we didn't assume that the agent had at least some good intentions, well, then really what we're doing is we're looking at bad actions that might happen to be good once in a while, which seems far less philosophically interesting or useful. It just seems far more clear-cut that, yeah, if somebody does something bad and it produces a good effect on accident, then it's not really morally permissible. It's still just a bad action. Additionally, when we start assuming one way or the other about the intentions of an agent, as the one doing the action, for one, evaluating intentions is very difficult to do for anybody but ourselves. And it ain't exactly a walk in the park for ourselves either. It's one of the fundamental lessons that psychology has taught us over the last couple of hundred years. So, for one, when we start dealing with intentions at all, it's hard for us to establish what the intentions of a given person are. Just like with Citizens United, we kind of had to assume that condition 2 was passed. because we have no idea what was going on inside of the Supreme Court justices' heads. We have some evidence of their reasoning given through the very detailed holding and written decision, but that doesn't give us access to what actually was going on in their heads. Just what they wrote down was going through their minds when they made the decisions that they did. Similarly, we might object to the idea of using intentions at all. If we are the sort of people that are strict consequentialists, we've got room to criticize the doctrine of double effect for allowing intentions to be part of our moral theory at all. It may be the case that intentions simply aren't relevant to moral judgments. What we intended in an action may not have any bearing on whether it was the right thing or wrong thing to do. Now, many of us would probably push back on that. A lot of us do have intuitions that intent matters. But similarly, in some cases, it seems to not matter at all. If someone were to, if we go back to our obvious moral wrong, if someone were to torture a baby for, say, an hour straight, but they believed they were doing it for good reasons, they had good intentions, that doesn't seem to really matter all that much in wake of what it is the person was doing. So it seems as though intentions don't have an influence in some situations, but it seems like they should matter in others. This is one of those areas where intuition is not necessarily the best guide on its own, and more careful thought and philosophical evaluation needs to happen. Additionally, someone might criticize the doctrine of double effect by pointing out issues with one or more of the conditions. They may say that these conditions don't cover enough of the situation, or maybe they exclude things that we actually want to include in these explanations. Like, for example, we may disagree with the evaluation of the two different trolley cases. And so we may say, well, no, the Fat Man scenario, it's obviously perfectly acceptable to push the Fat Man off the bridge. And so the conditions that made that action fail are not good conditions. Or we might say that this explanation is too narrow. The doctrine of double effect only gives 4 conditions that an action has to satisfy in order to be considered morally permissible. It may be leaving out something that very much needs to be discussed. Like, for example, in many discussions of the doctrine of double effect, people will add the condition, philosophers will add the condition that the person doing the action has done as much as they can to minimize the bad effect being produced, which the original formulation and the formulation that we have here doesn't actually require, but it seems to fit pretty well with the other 4. So we might wonder what other conditions might need to be added. Maybe the theory on its own, that is the explanation for why things are right or wrong on its own, isn't enough. The theory itself sort of fails to a certain degree. And that sort of makes the doctrine of double effect, as it's presented, less plausible as a theory. We might also worry that the doctrine of double effect isn't really much of a theory at all, that rather it's just a collection of loose, random, sort of associated exceptions to various moral principles. And so, again, we should reject it as a theory on its own, and instead more carefully examine each of the 4 conditions as just being separate and disjointed exceptions. This would be like pointing out, like, say someone has a theory of physics that doesn't really unify a number of different observations. They just have separate, loose descriptions of what objects do in various situations, but they don't have a unified theory of how these things fit together or what they mean overall or how they relate to each other. We might raise that similar sort of objection to the doctrine of double effect. It may be that as a theory, it's not very well put together. Instead, all it does is describe a series of loosely connected exceptions that we should spend more focus on individually rather than as a unified theory for why some actions are permissible and why they're not. And on its own, that might just seem like a small little nitpicky professional philosophers sort of worry. But if that's the case, then failing one or more conditions might not actually be a definitive problem for an action. Because if these things aren't unified into a single theory, well, then just the fact that it doesn't meet some criteria for being morally permissible doesn't mean that it's not overall still morally permissible. Like, for example, we usually excuse actions if they're done unintentionally. That is, if I do something bad without intending it in some way, if I do it accidentally or without knowing that what I was doing was wrong, then we usually say, well, it's not nearly so bad than if I did it knowingly. But just because I didn't meet that criteria in everything that I do doesn't mean that everything I do is automatically morally wrong. It just means that that criteria wasn't relevant in this case. Similarly, if the doctrine of double effect is nothing but loose associations of ideas or a loose collection of exceptions, then failing one may not be nearly so big of a deal. And we might simply say that, well, that condition is not relevant here. Instead, it's these other exceptions that we need to worry about or need to evaluate this on. So it's more than just a semantic worry about whether it's a single unified theory or not. It does have consequences for how we use this theory in evaluating things. But that's about all we've got time for. And honestly, it kind of hits the main points of the discussion I wanted to talk about. So, next time we're going to start looking at the problem of dirty hands and how we might approach it and some different perspectives on that problem. In the meantime, take a look at the journals and the videos linked on Blackboard if you haven't. The next video will assume that, just like you've done the readings, hopefully, you've watched the video Rules for Rulers, which you might find far more interesting than some of our ordinary readings, in that it both gives you a bit of a guide for being a dictator, if you're so inclined. If not, you might just find it amusing. But it also illustrates things, I think, in a rather fun way, and it'll be something that I think is applicable to our next discussion. As always, feel free to shoot me any questions or concerns you might have, and I will more than happily answer them. Till then, happy thinking, guys.